faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the Man of Steel, Superman.
Superman, to me, is the hero every kid dreams of becoming secretly.
We're losing our heroes, you know, and I think that Superman stands for really those American values that somewhere along the way that a lot of us have lost.
It's like a compilation of everything that's in our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution wrapped into one. It's something that kind of everyone can feel a part of. It's like a hero that doesn't exist, yet we wish he existed.
He doesn't need to be physically real for him to be worthwhile. He's just as effective as a fiction, because Superman, in both the fantasy world he exists in and the world he exists in here, serves one purpose, and that's to inspire.
Truth, justice, and the American way was something worth fighting for. And as corny as this sounds, one of the things that bothered me about criticism of Superman during the time when characters were becoming rather dark is that they just called him an overgrown Boy Scout. And my reaction was, and what the hell is wrong with that?
With all that power, he has to be constantly on guard against any kind of corruption. I think that is what keeps Superman that ultra straight arrow sort of Boy Scout that he has to be. A lot of people complain about that. You know, any chink in his armor is going to eventually bring him down. So he has to be that tower of virtue and honesty and strength and the truth, justice, and the American way thing. Just that's who Superman is.
But what is that? Truth, justice, and the American way. What is the American way?
What is it?
What does that mean? You know, what does that mean?
I don't know. What does it mean?
I have my own interpretation about what it means. I don't know what they all mean about it, you know?
Yeah.
Being the Constitution, that, you know, freedom and justice for all, we're all equal. There's
all equal, so, yeah.
Men,
that's the American way.
Women, all races, all nationalities.
Yep.
Freedom of expression, right?
Yep.
Whatever your point of view.
Superman was created by guys like us, two 17-year-old teenagers from Cleveland, Ohio, who weren't exactly the coolest guys in their class.
Jerry Siegel thought of Superman, thought of his character that could fly and bend steel and crash through walls and rescue people in distress, and had this dream about the Superman. Of course, him and Joe Shuster were good school buddies, and they would go to the Saturday matinee and they'd see Kent Taylor and Clark Gable and Errol Flynn and a lot of the swashbuckling, and that's actually where the name Clark Kent came from, was Clark Gable and Kent Taylor, their matinee idols. But so he early the next morning went over to Joe Shuster's house and said, I've got this idea for this character of Superman, and what do you think about, I want you to draw, you know, what this guy could look like. And so he took his pencil to a butcher paper, and they came up with this character in 1933 called Superman. It took him 5 years to actually get it published.
It was one of the hardest things in the world to sell. Nobody wanted Superman. These two kids tried submitting it to comic book companies. They tried submitting it to comic strip syndicates, the newspaper syndicates. All the people in the business seemed to see was a guy dressed up in a circus performer's costume, like an acrobat or like a strongman, doing things that nobody could possibly suspend their disbelief to buy into. And they were so desperately wrong, until one day somebody took a chance.
National Periodical took the chance on it, what they considered taking a chance, and henceforth Superman, which ended up being very, very popular, sold over a million copies the first month.
National periodicals hadn't a clue to the popularity because Superman didn't even appear on the cover of the next couple issues.
It was only when the sales figures came in to the people at DC Comics that they realized the covers with Superman were selling phenomenally well. Well, it finally hit home, and then from that time on, Superman was the cover feature of Action Comics. And in addition, they decided to make a very big, daring move and give Superman his own comic book. Superman #1 hit the stands in 1939. It actually had 2 printings, and the 2 printings together made it the very first comic book that ever sold 1 million copies. You would think that Siegel and Schuster would become millionaires having created Superman. Of course, what often happens in this great big business world of ours, the exact opposite is what took place. Siegel and Schuster, before long, were drafted, and they were off to fight World War II. While they were away, DC Comics hired a group of artists and writers to continue to turn out the adventures of Superman. And by the time the guys got out of the war and came back home, they found that their creation, Superman, had become the darling of the comic book business, huge success, big in merchandising. There was a Superman serial that Columbia Pictures had, a Superman radio show, and they were sharing in none of it.
Unfortunately, Siegel and Schuster ended up signing the rights to the character away for like $165 between the two of them.
They tried to sue to recover the rights and had lost that lawsuit in about 1947. Their names had been taken off the strip.
I think their prime years, their prime producing years, and their prime creative years probably were eaten up in kind of non-productive ways, which is really a shame because, you know, I would have loved to see what else could they have come up with, what else could Joe Shuster have done.
They felt that they were taken advantage of. They were only 17 years old. These big business executives, the way they felt, the monsters talked them into it.
They certainly spent the majority of their lives in some sort of litigation, and there's no way that's going to do you any good in in the long run, because their love was for drawing and writing.
Far from becoming millionaires, Siegel and Schuster really struggled throughout their lives.
It's the top 10 worst business decisions in American history.
It took other comic book companies about a minute to realize the great success in Superman.
And Superman was the granddaddy of them all, was the very first superhero. In fact, in 1946-47, there was a lawsuit regarding Captain Marvel.
There, DC sued immediately, and that lawsuit dragged on for 13 years because Captain Marvel was not quite Superman.
He was a character done in a more whimsical way, and the very early adventures were probably close to Superman's. As Captain Marvel went on, the elements became much more fantastic and, I guess, ridiculous to some, brilliant to others. Clark Kent's alter ego of Superman was an adult. Captain Marvel's alter ego was Billy Batson, who was a 10-year-old boy who said a magic word and became magically transformed into this perfect human specimen or superhuman specimen.
The greatest villain that Superman had was Lex Luthor. Probably the greatest villain that Captain Marvel fought was Mr. Mind, who was an inchworm. A very smart inchworm, but an inchworm nonetheless. The differences were huge. You can't say that the Fawcett writers and the Fawcett artists stood there copying Superman.
You could see that there were millions of dollars at stake. I mean, if DC had not tried to protect Superman, who knows, maybe Captain Marvel would still be a force to be reckoned with.
Fawcett finally took a hard look at what had become of the comic book industry, and a lot of superheroes were no longer being published. It became so expensive for Fawcett to continue to fight this case in court when the comic book sales were down so much that they finally decided to settle out of court and then agreed they would never publish Captain Marvel again. So in that regard, Superman wins another one, but this time in the courtroom. Superman jumped into the other media immediately. The first thing out of the cage was a phenomenal cartoon series done in 1939 by Max Fleischer for Paramount.
This looks like a job for Superman.
Max Fleischer, I think most people know who Max Fleischer was. He was had a great animation studio in Florida. He started in New York.
And it was a series of Superman cartoons that were gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. The animation is magnificent, the coloring, the lighting.
That's one of the first things that hits you about them is the awareness of the light.
Low lights, casting shadows.
Yeah.
It was great.
Gives them
You see the film noir thing in there almost.
step and she's doomed.
Animation standards are still way, way up there, used as comparison for everything else that's out there today, even computer-generated animation and so forth.
And they were totally unique. You know, nobody was doing, what, superhero animation at that time. And Fleischer was the only one. I mean, they stand out from that point of view. There wasn't anything else like that.
They were $100,000 a piece. That was a lot of money at the time for a, 10, 12-minute animation short. But they were expensive. They'd done 17 of them. There was, and they used them for many, many years after that. You could go to the Saturday matinee or you could go to the theater, and they always show a cartoon beforehand, and Superman was one of the favorites.
I think anybody in this whole business remembers those cartoons and is influenced by them.
The original serial of Superman starred Kirk Alyn.
In the beginning, it was very tough for Kirk Alyn. He had nobody to copy. Here you have a live-action actor here trying to figure out how to present himself on screen and take it to the next step from animation to actual live action.
Serials.
Serials in the theater.
In the theater, they had the black and white.
Where Kirk Alyn would up and away, and it would go from live action to animation.
You know, once the figure looked on the ground.
Obviously animation.
Cell animation.
Cell animation. You know, it wasn't
but was
airbrushed or anything.
as a kid, you're watching it and say, "Whoa, that looks different." But
It was
kind of neat.
It was kind of neat.
It was great.
Well, he figured that he had to convince himself, first off, that he was Superman, to be able to come across on screen in that way.
He made a good Superman because he had kind of that eagle flair, and he loved to do that and jump around. I guess he was a dancer once, he said. So he had the moves and the jumps.
Physically demanding, you better believe it. I mean, all the stunts and carrying Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen from one situation to the other and getting them out of trouble. And of course, if Superman was picking up Lois Lane or Jimmy Olsen or both of them, he couldn't, he had to make it look easy. So, I mean, Kirk Alyn had a real job ahead of him as far as they used dummies a couple of times, but for the most part, I mean, it was actually the actual actors that he was picking up, slinging over his shoulders and so forth.
They've been overcome by toxic gas. There's one more inside. Get an ambulance.
Superman! Sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman! Yes, it's
It was a
Superman.
15-minute show, and it went all through. It was midday. It was like after school. It was like 3:15 or something like that. Because I remember running home from school.
To listen
bam!
to it.
Get that radio on and listen to Superman.
You'll hit him! Jack, look out!
How interesting could you make it for radio? And it was that was a surprising success, because you couldn't see anything. You had to use your own imagination, just like everything else with radio.
Did you see what he was wearing?
Yeah, it looked like a red cape.
That's what I thought.
They had to come up with these sound effects, these swish sounds and
Up, and away!
The voice of Superman was Bud Collyer.
He was a famous personality at that time.
Yeah, well, he went on to TV for
game
show host and all that kind of stuff.
You've got to do something about it. You've got to. What can I do? That piece of kryptonite. You remember what effect it had on you? Yes, of course I remember. Robbed me of all my strength. It made me weak. That's right.
And Bud Collyer was very, very good at changing his voice from Clark Kent to Superman and so forth. And that's an interesting story, because a lot of people wonder where kryptonite evolved, and it actually evolved from the fact that Bud Collyer, after doing so many of the radio shows and people being familiar, listeners being familiar with his voice, He needed to take a vacation. Kryptonite was invented so they could get another actor in there with a voice that could kind of moan and groan, you know, while Bud Collyer was in Florida fishing or something, you know. And that, I mean, that was the reason Kryptonite came about.
The Adventures of Superman. Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. Yes, it's Superman. Strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Superman, who can change the course of mighty rivers, bend steel in his bare hands, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
The Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves, was a full-length feature called Superman and the Mole Man. The show actually aired in 1953. I believe it was February of 1953, and enjoyed the same type of success. The show went for 104 episodes, which lasted for 5 years. The most successful half-hour series in the history of television, next to I Love Lucy. So
They had a ball doing it. Nobody was paid very much money. They really had no idea initially what they had, that they were going to capture the hearts of the youth of America the way they did.
Yeah. But George used to call me Junior.
Junior, yeah.
And he had a very odd, to me, posture with a cigarette holder.
Oh, yeah. Right.
George
yeah.
smoked, but he had a long cigarette holder like Franklin Roosevelt. It was a black cigarette holder.
Yeah.
And so he would be smoking with the cigarette holder, and he'd often be preparing a rescue. And at least when I was the one
Yeah.
being rescued, and it was always something you were water was slowly rising, or bombs were going off, or something like that. And George would be standing there, and he always smoked till the last minute, and he'd be standing in the Superman outfit, smoking,
cigarette holder.
And he would peek around the corner if I'd be tied up ready for him to come through the wall or something.
Yeah.
And he would often peek around the corner to me, and he'd go. He'd say, "Don't worry, Junior. Super Boo's gonna save you." and I would actually start laughing.
Yeah.
So many of the time, I could tell when I would see the show that I can barely keep a straight face because he would disappear, then come through the wall or through the ceiling or through the floor or somewhere and save me. But it still makes me laugh. He was very funny and a swell guy, but he would often do that. Blow me a kiss. Don't worry, Junior. Super Boo's going to save you.
Oh, dear person.
George passed on in '59, so they weren't able to do that. But in passing on, he was supposed to sign up the day after his death. He was scheduled to sign up for another 26 episodes, and they were all supposed to get back together and do this, but never happened.
He's a wonderful person. I mean, so gallant.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
He was gallant.
Yeah.
I tell you, he had a nobility about him. He carried off being Superman. I only had, as Jimmy, I had a sweater and a bow tie to worry about.
Right.
He had the Superman insignia, and he was around in the Superman set. And you're around with a crew of regular guys. You're walking around in these tights all day long. It's a
or his underwear,
it's a tough,
as he used to
well,
call
yeah,
it.
his underwear.
Right, yeah.
It's tough to pull off with a degree of style, which he did.
Right.
And I always admired George. My memory of him is of a very gallant actor, and I thought he carried it off very well among the crew, being in what he called his underwear.
Yeah. Well, I always remember George standing there in front of the flag. I think it's something to be remembered.
I did not faint. I was just so tired from doing all those Superman stunts in that dream I had that I fell asleep. I did.
Well, anyway, Superman captured the crooks, and the good professor here isn't going to make any more gold at 3 times what it's worth.
No, indeedy. I certainly won't. Well, now that that's settled, suppose you two go out and start writing the story for the next edition.
Including my dream?
Definitely not.
Let's face it, Jimmy. Like I said, none of us will ever be able to do the things Superman does.
I guess not. But golly, Mr. Kent, you'll never know how wonderful it is to be like Superman.
No, Jimmy, I guess I never will.